The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. Lovin' baseball when we were 12 and innocent. My name is Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and my guest today, first of all, my guest interviewing is Alan Blumkin. He and I are going to interview George Case, Hal Bock, and if he gets here, David Hubler. What it was like to be 12, and what are your memories, gentlemen? I'm going to start with you right off the top of my head, George Case III. What do you say?
Well, a couple things, Ralph. Thank you for this topic. I think it's interesting. When I was 12 years old, I was playing Little League Baseball, and I was more involved, I think, in playing than actually following the game, although I followed the Washington Senators because my dad was a teammate and some of the Senators were personal friends. Obviously followed the Yankees, living in the area between New York and Philadelphia and the Phillies. Now, one memory I have of being 12 years old, and it was related to somebody who you guys, with your interest in the New York Giants, Willie Mays. Willie Mays in 1950 was playing in Trenton, and my dad had a sporting goods store, and he had a call from the Giants front office, and they said, George, we're sending a young man by the name of Willie Mays down. We think he's a pretty good prospect. Please give him whatever he needs and send the bill to us. So I think that that was somewhat of an understatement. Willie played in Trenton for about 6 weeks. He'd come up from Birmingham, then he went to Minneapolis, and of course in 51, made his major league debut, and the rest is history. Probably one of the greatest ball players of all time, Willie Mays, and that's certainly a memory of mine from when I was 12 years old.
Well, let's stay on that topic of Willie coming up. I'm going to go to Hal Bock and ask Hal Bock if he remembers the configuration of the 1951 Giants before they called Willie up, and
sure,
what they did afterwards to make room for Willie. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, Willie was so good that there was no way to keep him out of the lineup. He was a center fielder, and at that time, the Giants center fielder was a guy named Bobby Thompson, who became rather important later in that season. So what the Giants did, what DeRocher did, he scrambled the team a bit. He moved Bobby Thompson to third base. Bobby was not a third baseman, and he struggled, but he made his way. He managed to get through it. Willie Mays moved into center field and stayed there for the rest of his career. The Giants also, at that same time, they moved Marty Irvin from first base, where he was not really comfortable, to left field. And they put the left fielder, who was Whitey Lockman, he became the first baseman. So DeRocher scrambled the team pretty much, changing 4 players' positions. And it worked out. Willie became a star almost immediately. And
Hal, I want to ask you something, and Ralph, you might know. One of the things I had heard about, you talking about DeRocher, when Willie broke in to the Giants, he went like 0 for 8 or something like that, and he really got down on himself and wanted to go back to the minors, and DeRocher said, no, you're my center fielder. You'll break out. You're too talented not to. But I guess that was a true story, wasn't it, Hal?
Oh, yes, no question about it. And it was not 0 for 8. It was like 0 for 20 or 0 for 22.
Oh, was it really? Okay. I didn't realize what the numbers were. Right.
He was in a terrible way. And he was just a kid, and he just had lost all confidence in himself. Right. And he went to Leo and said, send me back. And Leo said, no way, you're the center fielder. Yeah. And he played center field, and he played in a night game at the Polo Grounds against the Braves. And the Braves starter was a man named Warren Spahn. Warren Spahn, in my mind, had the greatest career of any Major League Baseball player because he fought in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge and came home to win 373 games, more than any left-handed pitcher in the history of baseball. That's a pretty good accomplishment. So now Mays is in the Giants lineup against Warren Spahn, and I'm taking a bath. I'm in a bathtub listening to this game, and Willie hits one into the left field seats. His first Major League hit, his first Major League home run, off one of the greatest pitchers in the history of the game, Warren Spahn. And I got very excited about that. I can't begin to tell you.
I guess you did. That's a heck of a memory, Al. That's wonderful.
Oh, I was splashing around pretty good.
Now, you had already been to the Polo Grounds with your dad a number of times.
Yes.
What sticks in my head is early on, I don't know if it was at age 12, but early on, you and your dad talked about the possibility of you writing and what the press box was all about in the Polo Grounds.
Tell you that story. I can tell you that story.
Please, if you will.
The first time I went to the Polo Grounds was for something called the Mayor's Trophy game. That was a game an exhibition game between the Giants and the Yankees, with the proceeds to take care of Sandlot Baseball in New York. And so I'm 8 years old, and I walk into the ballpark with my dad, and everything is larger than life. I mean, I'd never seen a place that big. Grass for as far as you could see, light stanchions, seats everywhere, 55,000 seats. And I'm looking around, and my eye catches this structure that's hanging off the second deck behind home plate. And I asked my father what that was. And he said, oh, that's the press box. That's where the writers sit. And I looked at him and I said, the writers? He said, yeah, the baseball writers. That's where they sit. I said, they come here every day and sit there? He said, yes, that's their job. They write about the game. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. They sit here and that's their job? To watch a baseball game? What could be better than that? So at the age of 8 years old, I decided that was what I wanted to do for my life.
Wow.
That's a great story. Absolutely great story, Al.
That's a wonderful, heartwarming story for two reasons. You didn't get discouragement from your dad when you wanted to do that. He didn't say something like my dad did, bless his heart. What do you want to do with your life, Ralph? I want to be the New York Yankee announcer. Do you know how crazy that is? That you know how many people want to be the New York Yankee announcer? That's ridiculous. That's his favorite word, nonsense. Anything that didn't make, and I understand the generation he came from, he didn't want his son without security. It was the 50s, there was no fallback, there was no welfare, there was no, there's no food stamps, that kind of thing. And the depression mindset and that of a recent immigrant to this country, you don't think about the fantasy of this, that, and the other thing, the ridiculousness of it. But by the same token, it set me back quite a bit because I don't know if you guys realize it. I got you all together. I never became the announcer for the New York Yankees. he had a notion. That's good. But I give your dad some kudos for that, Hal.
Well, my father was a mailman. He worked hard delivering the mail, and he wanted something better for his son, and he said to me, "You can be anything you want." Now, I don't know that he believed that, but I believed it. He said, "You can be anything you want." Well, I want to be a baseball writer, because what possible job could be better than that? To come to the ballpark, watch a game, write a story, and go home and be paid for it. What a great job. And I can't complain. I had a very good career, very enjoyable career.
Okay. What greased the way for you becoming a baseball writer? The one thing that made it possible, besides that mindset of I can do it, that your dad instilled in you?
Well, if I'm going to be a baseball writer, I better go study journalism so I know how to do this job. So I went to New York University along with David Hubler. I was a year ahead of David. And I studied journalism. And the sports information director at NYU was a man named Hy Kersner. And he called me up one day and he said, "Hey, would you like to work for a newspaper?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I would." I was a freshman at the time. And he said, "Well, you go see Phil Pepe." Phil Pepe was going to be the schoolboy sports editor at the World Telegram and Sun, which was a great daily newspaper, an afternoon newspaper here in New York. And so I went down, I called him up, and I made an appointment, and I went down and I interviewed with Phil Pepe, and I became Phil Pepe's assistant. And I did that job for 4 years while I was in college, learning how it was to work at a newspaper. And I was writing every day. I was writing a short story every day about results of high school games. And then when I graduated and came back from the Army, from defending America, I called Phil, and Phil sent me to the New York Rangers, the hockey team. And I hooked on with them for a couple of years, and just one thing led to another, and I wound up at the Associated Press for 40 years, writing everything, including a lot of baseball.
Okay. The topic, and this is for both of you guys, the topic was when I was 12 and innocent. What made you less innocent over the years? In other words, when you were 12, how were you innocent? Let me start with George Case on this. How were you innocent about baseball?
Well, I think, I was innocent in a way that when you're young, the world is your oyster. You think you're invincible. There's no problem. I always wanted to be a ball player. That's what I wanted to be. The game came very easy to me. I thought, man, this is a great way. My dad was a ball player. Now I'm going to be a ball player. We're same name, same area. But innocence gives way to reality. And by the time I was in college, I realized and had, a young family that playing professional baseball was certainly not a reality, because my dad had told me, he said, "Hey, now that you're married with a family, you can't be knocking around the minor leagues, trying to make it to the show when you've got to pay your bills." And I appreciated that and was able to, make a career out of being in the athletic footwear business, which for me was the next best thing to being a ball player. So that was my innocence, the innocence of a 12-year-old giving way to the reality of a 22, 23-year-old with a family.
Okay. Alan Blumkin, I want you to ask whatever it is that's on your mind.
One thing I wanted to ask George for a long time, even though it's a little bit out of the area, did your dad talk much about the team with the 4 knuckleball stars?
Yeah, I think he did, Alan, only because I guess, I knew some of them personally. I mean, Dutch Leonard was a family friend, and that ball club had, really a rarity in having 4 knuckleballers as on your starting staff. So, yes, my dad did talk about that, and he talked about the fact that the ball club had to have 3 catchers to catch the 4 knuckleball pitchers. So it was something that I remember hearing as a young boy, never really knew what a knuckleball was until probably when I was maybe playing Little League, and Dutch Leonard came and visited our house, and my dad and Dutch started talking about Dutch throwing a knuckleball, and he always, my father told me, he and Dutch had been roommates one year, and that Dutch, some pitchers throw knuckleball with their knuckle, but in Dutch's case, he threw with his fingernails. And so he always had to have his fingernails filed down, which is what he did himself to make sure he could grip the ball properly, but he was probably one of the best knuckleball pitchers of all time.
Whoa. Alan, ask Mr. Hal Bock anything you want.
How do you see the Bobby Thompson game? Was it in person or were you watching it on TV?
No, I'll tell you that story. I was in junior high school. I was in junior high school at the time, and it was a 2-bus ride, 2 buses to get to and from that school. And I was in class that day, and it was a day game, and I jumped on the bus to go home, and got home, and it was, I think it was the beginning of the 9th inning, and the Giants were losing 4-1. And I had followed them all season long in this tremendous pennant race with the Dodgers, back and forth. And I thought, is this how it's going to end? That they're going to lose in the playoffs? That's terrible. So I refused to listen. My father, rest his soul, was listening on the radio because we had one of the first televisions in the neighborhood, but it broke down. It had been broken, and we had not had it fixed yet. So my dad was listening to Russ Hodges on the radio, and he was in the kitchen, and I went to the living room and sat down in a chair and started looking at the newspaper. And I became aware, because I could hear the radio, I became aware of the fact that the Giants were rallying, that Dark had a hit, and that Don Mueller had a hit. And I'm turning the pages, and I'm thinking, because I was superstitious at the time, I'm thinking, as I turn these pages, they're going to rally. And I kept turning pages, hoping I wouldn't run out of the newspaper's pages. And I kept turning the pages, and I heard my father yell, and I heard Russ Hodges call, "The Giants win the pennant, the Giants win the pennant." And I ran into the kitchen, and I started dancing with my father, because it was so thrilling for me to end that tremendous season. It was first of all, you have to remember, we had 3 teams here in New York, and the street corners every day and every night were arguments about Mays, Mantle, and Snyder and stuff like that. And it was a great pennant race. The Giants came back from 13.5 games behind in August and forced the playoff. And they won the first game of the playoffs, and they lost the second game 10-0. And now we came down to the third game that was going to settle everything. And I'm in school. How could I be in school at a time like this? Well, I was. And I ran home. I came home as quickly as I could, and I got there in time for that dramatic moment, that one of the greatest moments of my life. I mean, my son was born on January 6th, 1963. That was a great moment for me. We got married November 4th, 1961. That was a great moment for me. But, boy, that moment, October 3rd, 1951, that really was something for me.
That stood out. And, the enthusiasm in your voice makes my idea of a book only pale into comparison of your voice telling it. And I love doing podcasts, and I love having you guys as a guest. Close us out, George Case. Memories of that year, 1951.
Well, as I said, I followed certainly the Yankees, the Phillies, the Giants. The Giants.
Your own memories.
But the fact is, right, the memories I had was, following a team like Washington, who, I probably was the only kid in the whole area that followed the Washington Senators. And, I had a lot of friends, and they followed the Yankees or the Phillies or whatever, but I followed the Washington Senators because of my father. So that's my memories of being a 12-year-old, and I'd, go through the sporting news whenever I'd see it, go through the sports pages and had wonderful memories because some of those Washington players I personally knew. And they were teammates of my dad, and then a couple of them went to, were with the Yankees, a couple of them were with the Phillies, so I would follow them. And, the story I talked about at the beginning, certainly for exciting time for a 12-year-old to think that, hey, Willie Mays, came from Trenton and went to my dad's store. My dad talked to him, and all of a sudden he's, a major league star in New York the next year. So that's my memories, personal memories of, my life around the game of baseball when I was a 12-year-old.
George, may I ask you if there were any players who your memories of don't match up with what's generally known about these players, good, bad, or indifferent? I'm not looking for any scandals or anything, but tell us something good, perhaps, that we don't know about guys and how they're perceived.
Well, Ralph, that's interesting. And, I some of these fellows were personal friends of my dad's, and I knew them. You mentioned Dutch Leonard. I mean, I think I put on last week, Dutch Leonard was somebody who I knew. It was a good friend of the family's. When I was a little boy, he came and wrote a little inscription in my autograph book as a 10-year-old. But one thing I remember distinctly about Dutch Leonard, and this isn't anything that's earth-shattering, but it's a personal knowledge. Dutch Leonard was devastated and talked to my dad one year when he came to visit. His son, Tommy, had just lost his eye in a freak accident, and
wow.
Dutch, the general public wouldn't know that, but I remember I was maybe 8, 9, 10, whatever age I was, that Dutch was really so distraught because here's a young man, his boy. And his boy lost an eye in a freak accident, and my dad was so sympathetic and sad about that whole episode, and it really bothered Dutch personally, and that's certainly a memory that will always be, with me from the time I was just a youngster.
That's a horrible thing to have happen, obviously. I just thought of something. One of Alan Blumkin's favorite ball players is Gene Woodling, and your dad and Gene Woodling were teammates on the Indians. Al, would you like to take over and talk to George about Gene Woodling?
George, you have any memories of him?
Yeah, well, I do. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that Ralph brought that up, Alan. Gene Woodling and my dad were teammates with the 46 Indians, but they were also roommates. And I think, that was like Gene's rookie year, and I think my dad being a veteran, I think the Cleveland Indians wanted, my father to babysit Gene a little bit, but they became very good friends. And then in 1961, the expansion Washington Senators chose Gene Woodling in the expansion draft. So, here it is 15 years later. My dad's, third base coach for the expansion Senators, Gene Woodling's starting outfielder with Washington, and they're reunited. So, my dad and Gene Woodling, and I met Gene when I was a young boy and certainly met him later. And it was interesting for me to see, the fact that the Washington Ball Club, the expansion team, was going to rely on great veterans like Gene Woodling. And Gene was a terrific hitter, but he was getting older. He was nearing the end of his career, and as a result, Washington was stocked with a lot of veteran ball players. The first 2 months of the season, they played 500 baseball. By the end of the season, they were 61 and 100. So, they lost 2/3 of their games the last 3 months of the season. And Gene Woodling, I know, was certainly a great player. And Alan, you'll recall him with the Yankees, and Gene later on became a sales rep for Golf Pride Golf Grips, lived in Ohio. Terrific guy. And, my memories of Gene Woodling are really very fond. I thought he was a terrific guy.
Alan has a great story about Gene Woodling and Casey Stengel when Gene Woodling was with the Mets.
Yeah, Gene Woodling went to the Mets in 1962. He was 40 years old at the time.
Right.
So he's sitting by Casey Stengel when the Mets are losing another one. And Stengel turns to Woodling and said, "Ain't like the old days, is it?"
Well, you know what, Alan? That's a great story, and I can imagine Casey saying that, and he and Woodling went back a long way with those great Yankees teams. But when you're talking about Woodling being 40 playing with the Mets, the Mets had a bunch of aging veterans just like the expansion Senators did, and Woodling was part of the trade, I think, from Washington to the Giants. And to the Mets, and that's when Woodling, was playing for the Mets when they had Ashburn and Spahn and Yogi and all that stuff, all those, great players, but obviously all past their prime. And the same had been the, case with the Washington Ball Club.
Okay.
And we achieved a record of 40 and 120 that year, a record number of losses.
Right.
40 and 120.
Yeah, that's that's amazing because I didn't realize what those numbers were, but they bettered the losing record of the expansion Senators, that's for sure.
Okay.
By accident, you should win more than 40 games, wouldn't you say?
I would say. People would say, my gosh, if you can play 500 baseball, but to lose that number, that's a hard thing to do. That's a big number.
They were remarkable. They were the great.
If you would think about it, their statistics didn't belie losing that many games. Frank Thomas hit a bunch of home runs. 34, right? And they just weren't as bad on paper as they were in person, and the intangibles sometimes work against you. There were mess-ups of guys that shouldn't be messing up. Richie Ashburn and would make bonehead plays and, take bad routes to the ball and what have you in center field.
There's a famous story. The shortstop for that team was a guy named Elio Chacon. And Elio did not speak English. So Frank Thomas was playing left field, and he's coming in, and here comes Elio going out for a pop fly, and Thomas is yelling him off, but Elio doesn't understand what Thomas is saying. So there are those kinds of stories throughout the year, throughout the season.
Yeah, well, wasn't Hal and Ralph and Alan, wasn't it Stengel that said wrote a book or something about can't anybody here play this game?
It was Jimmy Breslin.
All those crazy things were happening. And a guy like Throneberry, and I think it was Throneberry, he hit a triple, and they said, they called him out because he missed second base, and somebody said, well, Casey, he missed first base too. So.
Yeah, that was the first base coach. Yeah,
is that what it was?
Cookie Lavagetto.
You guys have great memories. I was at that doubleheader in June of '62. I think it was the 23rd, and I got to see that game, and I got to see in another game that day Lou Brock, who was like 150 pounds soaking wet in those days, somehow got a hold of a ball and hits it into the bleachers, one of only 6 or 7 guys ever to do that. So not only did Throneberry miss 2 bases, but Brock hit a home run into the bleachers, and I went home with a Ken Hubbs broken bat, which we'll save for that story for another day. We're going to save it for this day, and I'll tell you why. Your old AP buddy Marty Rose is in on this one. Well, I'll be brief. I get there early. I can't find anybody to go to the game, so I go myself. It's beautiful day. I buy box seats right behind third base, and I'm standing in those days. They had, as you guys know, extended batting practice where they put up the cage and they have infield practice. I get there early and I watch, and I'm standing by the rail at third base, and Joe Pignatano hits a weak ground ball to me at third. I scoop it up, and I've got the first and only ground ball, baseball that, hit, foul ball, call it what you want. An usher comes up to me, and he says, "Hey, listen, I don't know if I can get a bat, but there's a kid over there in a wheelchair, and he can't carry a bat, but he'd love that ball, and if you give him that ball, I'll try to get you a bat, broken bat." So I said to myself, wow, you'll never get another chance for a bat. Give the kid the ball. Give the kid the ball in the wheelchair. He comes back, the usher comes back in a few minutes with a Ken Hubbs broken bat. Wow, Ken Hubbs. So 3 years later, I'm about to go in the Air Force, and I knew instinctively that my mother would throw that broken bat out as soon as I signed up. They said, "Ralph Tiger of the United States Air Force." My mother had that bat in the incinerator. Would have had that bat in the incinerator. So I asked Marty Rose, your old friend,
yes,
and my best friend growing up, I asked his mother if she wouldn't be good enough to keep the bat for me while I was in the Air Force. And sure enough, she forgets that what the bat was about. It was broken. She threw the bat out. I would have been incredibly mad at my mother. You can't be mad at your best friend's mother. So, but all these years, and then the next year, Ken Hubbs dies tragically in a private plane accident. Yeah. So that's my 1962 Met thing. See how our podcasts always go from here to there, and they always put a smile on our faces? I wish David Hubler were here. I will interview him and get his memories of. He's a year younger, am I correct?
At least a year, maybe more, maybe 2 or 3.
Oh, okay. Well, you're almost 40 yourself.
Me?
Yeah.
I was 40 a few years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all 4 of you, 3 in this case, you haven't lost a step. And we're talking about being in your prime. You guys will never lose your prime. Thank you for another terrific podcast. The memories just thrill me. I was walking with the phone, and you were talking about dancing with your dad yet again. Every time you talk about that story, I didn't hear the bathtub one. But before, that was the first one. But dancing, I can picture you in the kitchen or the living room by the radio and what have you, and I can picture the look in your eyes, just, oh my God, what Giants fans.
It was, Ralph, it was pure joy. It's the best thing you could imagine. I mean, at that time, for a kid 12 years old, it was It was magic. It was the best thing you could imagine.
Thank you
and it's
for
a memory
sharing that.
I'll keep forever.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing your memories, George, and thank you for being my co-host on this one, Alan Blumkin.
Good night, everybody. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Alan, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything you want to ask just before we go so you're not slighted?
Okay. I just want to ask Hal and George if they ever collected baseball cards.
If I ever caught?
Collected baseball cards.
No. My baseball cards disappeared when we moved from the Bronx to Queens. And I know who the culprit was in that affair, my mother. She was just cleaning out,
yeah.
you know, and my baseball cards went out to the wind. So I would be a rich man today if I had those cards.
Yeah.
I have essentially the same story. George?
George may be gone.
George may be gone. Hey, thank you guys again. Terrific show, and we'll do it again next month.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.